Hi guys, I hope everyone's doing well. I thought I'd give you a Cold War video to help you with the web quest that I'm going to ask you to do next week. So let's start with our ideas of the Cold War. We have 45 years, which is a long time, and if you guys remember from 10th grade, it's a war of words that stops short of actual fighting because actual fighting can be nuclear. It includes a divided Germany and divided Europe and a divided world for that matter. And you might remember MAD, mutually assured destruction. And many historians are still debating, social scientists are still debating whether the Cold War has actually ended or not. Here we see, before FDR dies, of course, we see Churchill, FDR, and Stalin laughing it up at Yalta. And here we see Truman and Churchill and Stalin at Potsdam. Now, at Yalta, they decided that there would be free and open elections in Eastern Europe, which of course Stalin's going to disregard later and lie about. At Potsdam, they basically came together to see how this war was going to end, and that's where then the United States declared to Japan that they had a weapon of mass destruction. So let's talk about these first steps into the Cold War, this post-World War world. So first we see that Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, had lost so much of her wealth, probably 1/3 of her wealth because of the Second World War. And like I said before, at Yalta in 1945, the Russians had already occupied much of Eastern Europe, and they were very close to Berlin. And although Stalin said he was going to leave Eastern Europe or give them open and free elections, that was never his intent. He wanted a buffer zone. At Yalta, all sides agreed that Germany would be divided into zones of occupation. Russia would receive reparations from Germany, and Eastern European countries would be allowed to have free elections, like I said, but that's not going to happen. In those countries, all key political positions, of course, in Eastern Europe were held by Kremlin-trained communists. Those are the ones that the Soviets wanted in charge. Here you see a map of a divided Germany. England, France, and the United States do control parts of Western Germany, but we leave. The Western Allied powers leave. The Soviets really don't. Stalin wanted security, of course. His country had been definitely invaded, and he wanted, like I said, that buffer zone. Truman was distrustful, of course, of Stalin, and so he ordered all aid shipments to Russia stopped. This is about the time that Winston Churchill, who's no longer the Prime Minister of England at this time, but he's on a speaking tour, and he comes to Fulton, Missouri, of all places, and he gives probably his most famous speech, which is that Iron Curtain speech, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has fallen across the continent. It was a warning to the Americans to pay attention, to say, look at Stalin, the Soviets, the communists, they have control of Eastern Europe. In 1947, Truman issued the Truman Doctrine, and basically it said the United States would help any nation fight against communism. And of course, the first two countries we give aid to are Turkey and Greece, who become very important Cold War allies. In June 1947, the U.S. developed the Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Act, which helped the European nations recover, like a stimulus package. We offered it, of course, to all European countries, but only Western European countries accepted our aid because there was a catch. You had to be capitalist and you had to trade with the United States. And of course, Eastern European countries couldn't guarantee that. In 1948, the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia. In 1948, Stalin closes all access routes into West Berlin, trying to starve the other allies out of Berlin and close that window. This, of course, is called the Berlin Blockade. We're not going to have that, so we counter with the Berlin airlift, dropping about 5,000 tons of food supplies a day by airlift into the western sectors of Berlin. This lasts for 324 days when the Soviets finally give up. Again, it's 1948. The war has only been over 3 years. Nobody wants another war. In 1949, we form our most important alliance to date, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO. And then in 1955, Stalin counters with his own alliance of forced alliance, well, pretty much ours is too, with the Warsaw Pact. Here you see the countries of the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and then non-aligned, at least this is in 1960 that you can see. This is just a political cartoon looking at Stalin as a basketball player trying to block the Marshall Plan. Stalin dies in 1953, and Stalin's fear tactics, his purges, his horribleness, basically couldn't be maintained. And the leaders of the USSR knew they had to trade, they had to open up, they couldn't be self-sufficient. So the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, says, we're going to be de-Stalinizing the Soviet Union. We're going to go away from what he did. So he attacks Stalin and he distances himself from his programs. And there was talk of reform a little bit, a little capitalism, but the hardline communists said no way. Khrushchev invested lots of money on the needs of the people, and the standard of living did improve in the Soviet Union, and people liked that. Here's Khrushchev and his bromance partner, Fidel Castro. They love each other. And of course, you remember Fidel Castro's the communist leader of Cuba, and they're going to get into some trouble together. Khrushchev is going to consolidate collective farms, and he's going to increase the amount of agricultural land. In 1956, a writer named Boris Pasternak wrote Dr. Zhivago, which showed the limits of this thought, and he's going to receive a Nobel Peace Prize, but of course the Soviets are not going to recognize his work. And then in 1962, another writer wrote One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was hounded by the government, and he was arrested. Khrushchev adopted a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West until the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets, of course, wanted to buddy up with African and Asian countries, so they sent lots of millions of dollars of aid to those countries, and so did we. And in 1956, Russia launched Sputnik, and we were astonished that they get to have the first satellite in space, they get to have the first man in space, we send a monkey, they send a man, but ultimately we're the first on the moon, so there. And then, of course, in 1962, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, if you remember, was the nights where both countries held their breath. And we could have had nuclear war. It was an elaborate game of chicken in which the Soviet Union said bonk bonk. This is just a little picture of Dr. Zhivago, the movie. If you get a chance, if you're bored, YouTube it. It's weird. It's interesting. Of course, there were people who were living under the Iron Curtain's grasp that didn't want to live under the Iron Curtain. And so we see rebellions. And the tension with China increased because Mao and subsequent leaders really didn't see communism the same way. And so European satellites, those countries behind the Iron Curtain, saw an opportunity to establish their own independence. The first revolt we see is Hungary. And when I say revolt, I mean unsuccessful revolts, because the Soviets will come in and crush it with tanks. But in 1956, the liberal communists, there are such a thing, wanted to have elections. Soviet troops were forced out of the country, but when Hungary tried to distance itself and renounce its ties, of course the Soviet troops returned. Hungarians hoped that they would get aid, but they don't. And it's all because that mutually assured destruction fear. Khrushchev was replaced in 1964 by a guy named Leonid Brezhnev. And in his reign, we have the Czechoslovakian uprising. In 1968, a guy named Alexander Dubček gained control of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. And again, it's a reform movement. And he tried to reaffirm his support for the Warsaw Pact, but he also said reform was necessary. I think he tried to play both sides. And he wanted to create socialism with a human face, so basically less totalitarianism. Talk of liberalization worried the Soviets, of course, and they acted on it, and over 500,000 troops entered Czechoslovakia and ended what was known as the Prague Spring. Yes, this is his real eyebrows. This is Leonid Brezhnev. Wow. Yeah, he's scary looking, I know. Brezhnev issued something called the Brezhnev Doctrine. So we have the Truman Doctrine, we have the Brezhnev Doctrine. And said that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any countries that were communists. And so he's going to kind of go back to Stalin's policies. In 1982, Brezhnev died, replaced by this guy named Yuri Andropov, who ruled for only 2 years. So there's a bit of a shakeup going on in the 80s. And then Chernenko is going to become the leader in 1984. And the problem was that the guys who were part of the old guard, who remembered the revolution, they were dying, and the Soviet Union was changing, and the world was changing, and there was a lack of consumer goods, and people weren't always really enthralled with communism. So how does this end, and is the Cold War really over, is really the question. We see an end to what we saw the Soviet Union had modeled itself after, definitely by 1990, 91. One of the people I always think about with the end is this guy on the cover of Time magazine. His name is Lech Walesa, and he is a unionist. He's a worker, a stockyard worker in Poland. And what is so ironic to me is that Karl Marx said that communism would start with the workers, and for Poland, it ends communism with the workers. So in 1980, in a place called Gdańsk, Poland, they went on strike, and they wanted free speech, and they wanted the right to form unions, and they were led by Lech Walesa. The movement becomes known as Solidarity, and it became very popular, and they had to agree, the Polish government, the communist Polish government, had to agree that they would allow unions. But once Solidarity gained support, it didn't really change the government, so there were still problems. And in fact, in 1981, General Jaruzelski basically declared martial law, and then Walesa is arrested, and there's a lot of upheaval. To the rescue comes Pope John Paul II, who was born in Poland, and he urged people to protest. He said, down with communism. Communism is against religion, and more than the majority of people in Poland are Roman Catholic, and they wanted to practice their faith openly. So when you get the Pope's support, that's pretty good. So Walesa is going to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983. He'll later become a leader, a president of Poland, I think it's prime minister, and he'll change things. The other guy, of course, that we look to the end of communism in Europe is this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, which has, of course, the very, interesting forehead birthmark. Kind of looks like Italy. But if he's ever in a cartoon, usually the cartoonists in the political cartoons will show that birthmark. So in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the head of the Soviet Union, and the problem is there's a scarcity of consumer goods. We can understand that right now with the coronavirus issues and the lack of pasta. You guys understand that. If you've been to the store in the last week or two, you know that lack of consumer goods are not good. They make people fearful. They make people hoard things. Then the people in the Soviet Union had money, and they couldn't buy what they needed. So Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, introduced perestroika, which says basically we're going to have a little capitalism. And then glasnost, openness, free speech. I still want to be in the room with the first guy who criticizes Gorbachev. Like, is he scared that it's not true? This is very different for Russians. They don't know how to criticize their government and live. And Gorbachev even went as far as to criticize Stalin. Oof, yeah. Gorbachev traveled, and his wife and him looked modern. It was a new age. I just remember seeing him on television. And the problem, though, is that once the Soviet control weakened, ethnic tensions rose up. And that's what we're going to see Chechnya and Georgia, not Georgia and the United States, and later Bosnia and the Serbs. You're going to see these old nationalistic flares happen again. By 1985, the Brezhnev Doctrine's done. And by 1988, Hungary was trying to reform and allowed vacationing East Germans to come through Hungary into Austria. And in 1989, the East German leader, Erich Honecker, also gambled. And he said, look it, Germans, you can travel. East Germans, you can travel and come back. And so a trickle became a flood, and 350,000 East Germans left East Germany by 1990, most going just to West Germany. And then Gorbachev told them, Honecker, you're on your own. We don't have the money to help you, and we don't have the money to stop them. So in 1989, the East Germans opened the Berlin Wall. And when I say open, they took it down brick by brick, and they had a party. And we'll talk about this more, but 1989 is perhaps as important as 1789 in terms of the shift and the changes. In Czechoslovakia, the people were led by a playwright, actually, Havel, who staged the Velvet Revolution. And a lot of these revolutions have colors. That's just basically it. and they ousted the communists in 10 days. Only in Romania did we see the government try to keep communism, probably because of this communist dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, who ordered his troops to open fire on protesters. And then what they did was they shot him, the protesters did, after they put him on trial. So they found him guilty and shot him. So that's what you get. By 1990, almost all of Eastern Europe is done with communism. They're having free elections, they're trading, they're figuring out things like a microwave oven. They didn't have these consumer goods. They wanted Levi jeans, they wanted McDonald's, they wanted so much that they knew was out there, but they just couldn't get. And what's going to happen to the Soviets then? Lithuania held elections and declared its independence. Gorbachev said, no, Lithuania, you're part of the Soviet Union. He sends troops. It's probably a bad idea. Russian politicians become pretty worried. But then in May 1990, a hardliner named Boris Yeltsin becomes the new leader of something called the Russian Federation. And he was the first Russian leader basically ever to be voted in by popular vote. And Yeltsin threatened to pull Russia out of the USSR, thus reducing Gorbachev's power. Here's a picture of Clinton and Boris Yeltsin just yakking it up and having fun time. And so Gorbachev responded by offering a new agreement. He said, look, we'll have 15 republics. We'll have the Republic of Russia. But 6 republics say no. So in 1991, a small group staged a coup. They kidnapped Gorbachev, who's on vacation. Gorbachev disavowed the rebels, and Yeltsin rallied the legislature and people against the conspirators. In the wake of this coup, Yeltsin strips the Communist Party of all its power. He declares Russia to be independent and withdraws from the Soviet Union, and everybody's like, oh my Lord. Gorbachev was a man without a job. He reformed his sway right out of a job, so he is seen as the last communist leader of the Soviet Union. The shock therapy associated with the economic changes and privatization is going to lead to crime, and especially the Russian mafia's power will grow, and it's still a thing. And many of those who benefited, of course, were part of the old line, the old Communist Party, and they had the money, they had the influence, the connections. Rampant inflation, production issues are going to plague Russia in the 1990s. But new capitalists, of course, are good at acquiring wealth, oil, natural resources. Right now, Russia really is the natural gas provider for Europe, and so they have a lot of power because they can threaten to cut off energy to Europe. Yeltsin crushed a parliamentary uprising in 1993 by using the military, and in 1996 election, he was able to win, and probably because of his industrial connections. But most Russians didn't understand democracy, and we've seen that many times. You can give countries democracy, but it doesn't mean they're ready. And so here we see pictures of our guy, Vladimir Putin. In 2000, okay, so it's 2020. So for 20 years, we've seen this guy with his shirt on, with his shirt off, with his aviator glasses. Here he is, hanging out on a horse. And he won a landslide in 2004. And then the economy starts to boom and people love him. And just this month, he recently passed a new term limit rule, and it says that he can rule Russia until the year 2036. Here we go. In 1990, you see in blue the NATO countries, and then in 2015, up to today, really this is the best map I can get you, is that former Warsaw Pact countries are now NATO countries, with some exceptions there in East, and of course Russia. They're not invited to be part of NATO. But I guess the question is, has the Cold War really ended or just shifted to new politics? Okay, I hope that helps. Your next class will be doing the web quest that I'll put on Google Classroom. Bye, guys.